HOA Karen told me my lake access was illegal, standing on a dock her family had been using for years. What she didn't know was a judge would give me the power to shut her dock down permanently. The first time I met Karen, she was standing at the edge of the lake with her arms crossed, sunglasses too large for her face, lips pressed into a thin, permanent line of disapproval. It was early summer, the kind of morning where the water looked like glass, and the air smelled faintly of wet wood and algae. I had just finished repairing a loose plank on the small wooden path that led from my backyard down to the shoreline. I'd owned the house for 6 years, long enough to know every creek in the dock, every change in the water line, every neighbor who minded their own business. Karen was not one of those neighbors. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't say hello. She simply cleared her throat loud enough to announce her presence, then said, "You're not allowed to be here." I looked up from my tools, confused, and asked her what she meant. She gestured broadly at the lake, as if she owned the horizon itself, and said my access was illegal. According to her, the HOA had exclusive control over lake usage, and my path, my dock, and my boat launch violated multiple community rules. She spoke quickly and confidently, the way people do when they believe authority comes from volume rather than truth. I told her calmly that my deed included lake access, that the dock had existed long before the HOA was formed, and that I had documentation to prove it. Karen smiled then, a sharp, satisfied smile, and said documentation didn't matter if the HOA said otherwise. She informed me she was the chair of the Waterfront Compliance Committee, a title that sounded important but meant nothing to me at the time. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, already dialing someone on her phone. That afternoon, I received my first notice. It was taped directly to my back door, printed on bright yellow paper, warning me of violation for unauthorized use of HOA-controlled lakefront. The fine was modest, but the language was aggressive. It demanded immediate cessation of lake access and threatened escalating penalties. I laughed at first, assuming it was a misunderstanding that would be cleared up with a phone call. I had no idea it was the opening move in a campaign Karen had been waiting to run. Over the next week, the notices multiplied. Each morning brought a new envelope, each one more threatening than the last. Karen cited rules that didn't exist, referenced amendments that were never passed, and copied half the neighborhood on emails accusing me of stealing community resources. She claimed my dock was a safety hazard, that my kayak blocked emergency access, and that my presence reduced property values. People who had waved at me for years suddenly avoided eye contact. I requested a formal hearing with the HOA board. Karen responded within minutes, denying the request on the grounds that the issue was already decided. When I pushed back, she CC'd the association's attorney and warned me that continued resistance could result in legal action. It was clear she wasn't interested in resolving anything. She wanted submission. What Karen didn't know was that before I bought the house, I'd done my homework. The property had once been part of a much larger parcel, owned by a family that developed the shoreline decades earlier. When the HOA formed, it acquired certain common areas, but not all of them. My section of the shore had been explicitly excluded, a fact recorded in county filings and referenced in my deed. The dock was not a privilege. It was a right. Still, rights mean little when someone with time, ego, and a printer decides to make you miserable. Karen began showing up unannounced, taking photos, measuring distances, and leaving handwritten notes accusing me of noncompliance. She told neighbors I was under investigation. She told the board I was hostile and uncooperative. She even called the non-emergency police line once, claiming I was trespassing on HOA property. The responding officer reviewed my paperwork, apologized, and left. Karen watched from her porch, furious. The breaking point came when I discovered crew removing boards from my dock. They said they were hired by the HOA to neutralize an unauthorized structure. I stopped them immediately and demanded paperwork. They had none, just a work order signed by Karen. I told them to leave, or I'd call the sheriff. They left, but the damage was done. Several boards were gone, and one support beam had been weakened. That night, I decided enough was enough. I gathered every document I had, the deed, the survey, historical plats, old photographs, even handwritten notes from the previous owner. I filed a formal complaint against the HOA and requested an injunction to stop further interference with my property. Karen responded by escalating. She sent out a community-wide email claiming I was suing the neighborhood and threatening everyone's lake privileges. It was a lie, but lies spread faster than truth when they're convenient. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, Karen continued her campaign. She installed temporary fencing near my shoreline, claiming it marked HOA boundaries. She placed no trespassing signs facing my yard. She even attempted to block my access path with landscaping rocks. Each move was bolder than the last, driven by the belief that authority came from persistence. When the day of the hearing arrived, Karen walked in carrying a thick binder, her confidence unmistakable. She spoke first, presenting her version of events with practiced indignation. She framed herself as a guardian of community standards, protecting shared resources from selfish individuals. She accused me of exploiting loopholes and undermining neighborhood harmony. The board members nodded along, some of them clearly tired of the conflict and eager for it to end. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult Karen. I simply laid out the facts. I presented the deed, the survey, the county records. I showed how the HOA's authority stopped short of my shoreline. I demonstrated that Karen had acted without board approval, without legal basis, and without regard for property rights. The room grew quiet as the evidence mounted. The association's attorney asked for a recess. When the board returned, their tone had changed. They acknowledged a mistake, rescinded the fines, and ordered an immediate halt to all enforcement actions against me. Karen protested loudly, insisting they were wrong, that they were being manipulated. The board chair cut her off and reminded her that she was a volunteer, not a judge. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. As the meeting adjourned, Karen leaned toward me and whispered that this wasn't over. She said she had friends in the county, that judges made mistakes, and that docs could disappear overnight. Her eyes were cold, calculating. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about rules or lakes or property lines. It was about control. And Karen wasn't used to losing it. What she didn't realize was that by pushing this far, she had crossed a line of her own. The next move wouldn't be handled by an HOA board or a neighborhood committee. It would be handled in a courtroom, with consequences she never imagined. Karen did not wait long to make her next move. Within 3 days of the HOA board formally rescinding the fines, a new letter arrived. This one sent certified mail, stamped with urgency, and addressed not just to me but to any occupant or interested party. It claimed that newly discovered bylaws had come to light, bylaws that allegedly clarified lake usage and retroactively invalidated any private shoreline claims. The timing alone told me everything I needed to know. Karen hadn't found new rules. She had written a new story. I read the letter carefully, twice, then set aside and walked down to the lake. The dock looked smaller than usual, not physically but emotionally, as if it were now a contested object rather than the quiet place it had always been. Karen's dock sat 50 yards down the shore, larger, newer, and clearly within what she now claimed was common HOA space. Her family's pontoon boat was tied up, its cover half on, half off, as if even it were unsure of its welcome. That evening, Karen sent another email, this time accusing me of harassing her by loitering near HOA control water. I replied with one sentence and an attachment, a copy of the board's decision. She responded with silence, which was never a good sign. Karen was the kind of person who only went quiet when she was planning something louder. The next escalation came in the form of enforcement visits, not from the HOA, but from county inspectors. One cited me for an unpermitted structure, another for potential environmental impact, a third for alleged encroachment on protected shoreline vegetation. Each inspector was polite, professional, and visibly confused when I showed them my permits and surveys. Each left without issuing a citation. Each visit, however, took time, energy, and peace of mind. Karen watched from her porch every time, arms crossed, chin raised, taking notes. Neighbors began to choose sides. Some stopped by to quietly offer support, admitting Karen had gone too far. Others parroted her talking points, warning me that I was rocking the boat and threatening property values. One even suggested I remove the dock voluntarily to restore harmony. I asked him if Karen planned to do the same. He didn't answer. Then came the notice that mattered. The HOA filed a formal complaint in county court, seeking a declaratory judgment on lake access rights. Karen's name appeared nowhere on the document, but her fingerprints were all over it. The association claimed ambiguity in the original land division and asked the court to rule that all shoreline access belonged to the HOA. It was a bold move, expensive, risky, and completely unnecessary. It was also exactly what Karen wanted. The moment I read the filing, I understood her strategy. If she couldn't win through enforcement, she would try to rewrite history. If the court ruled in the HOA's favor, Karen wouldn't just control me. She would control the lake. Every dock, every boat, every shoreline path would fall under her committee's authority. This wasn't about stopping me anymore. It was about expanding her kingdom. I hired an attorney the next morning. He specialized in property law and had seen HOA disputes before, but even he raised an eyebrow when he reviewed the case. The documentation was unusually clear. The exclusion of my shoreline was explicit, recorded, and referenced multiple times over decades. He said the HOA's argument was weak, but warned me not to underestimate the damage a determined plaintiff could cause. Karen, meanwhile, acted like she'd already won. She posted in the community forum about restoring order and protecting shared assets. She hosted a lakeside gathering for select neighbors, positioning herself as the benevolent steward of the water. Her dock became a stage, her laughter loud, her confidence infectious. People wanted to believe her, because believing her meant the problem would go away. During discovery, the truth began to surface. Emails revealed Karen had pressured the HOA board to file the lawsuit, threatening to resign publicly if they didn't act. She had drafted much of the complaint herself, despite having no legal training. She had contacted county offices repeatedly, misrepresenting facts to trigger inspections. She had even suggested in writing that removing my dock by any means necessary would be cheaper than litigation. My attorney smiled when he read that line. It was the kind of sentence judges notice. As depositions began, Karen was called to testify as a witness. She arrived confident, dressed professionally, carrying another binder. Under oath, however, confidence gave way to contradiction. She claimed she acted on board authority, then admitted she often acted alone. She said she relied on legal advice, then conceded she ignored the association's attorney when he disagreed with her. She insisted the lake was always HOA property, then acknowledged she had never reviewed the original plats until after the dispute began. The more she spoke, the more the narrative unraveled. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was inventing them. And worse, she was doing so selectively, targeting me while ignoring similar docks owned by friends and allies. The pattern was undeniable. The judge issued a temporary order maintaining the status quo until trial. No docks could be removed, no access restricted, no new enforcement actions taken. It was meant to calm things down. For Karen, it was an insult. She viewed it as weakness, an opening rather than a boundary. One morning, I woke to find caution tape strung across my access path, tied to stakes hammered into my yard. A laminated sign read, "Area closed, pending litigation." Karen stood nearby, phone in hand, recording. I removed the tape calmly and walked to the lake. She shouted after me, accusing me of contempt of court. I reminded her, loudly enough for the camera, that the order said no access could be restricted. She stopped recording. That incident became Exhibit A. As the trial date approached, Karen's allies began to disappear. Board members distanced themselves. Neighbors stopped attending her gatherings. The association's attorney pushed for settlement, suggesting a compromise that preserved my access while granting the HOA limited oversight. I agreed. Karen did not. She sent an email declaring she would never accept a loss and that the community deserved a definitive ruling. The night before trial, I walked down to the lake alone. The water was dark, reflecting only the faint lights from distant houses. Karen's dock loomed to the left, pristine and untouched. For the first time, I noticed how far it extended, how much space it occupied, how it subtly blocked the shoreline. I realized then what the judge would see too. Karen had drawn lines everywhere except where they actually belonged, and the court was about to redraw them for her. Karen thought the courtroom was where she'd win. She didn't realize it was where the lake would finally turn against her. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and recycled air, the kind of place where time slowed and decisions lingered long after they were spoken. Karen arrived early, seated confidently in the front row, papers arranged neatly, posture rigid with expectation. She looked like someone who had rehearsed victory so many times she could already feel it. I sat quietly behind my attorney, watching her greet people with practiced warmth, as if this were a community meeting rather than a legal reckoning. When the judge entered, the room settled into silence. He was older, methodical, and had the calm demeanor of someone who had seen hundreds of disputes built on ego rather than law. He began by summarizing the case in plain language, stripping away the emotion and focusing on what mattered, who owned what, and who had the authority to say so. Karen shifted slightly in her seat when he mentioned that property rights were not subject to popularity or convenience. The HOA's attorney spoke first. He presented the argument Karen had pushed for months, claiming historical ambiguity and the need for uniform control of the lake to preserve community harmony. He spoke carefully, avoiding definitive statements, framing everything as reasonable uncertainty. When he finished, the judge nodded politely and turned to my side. My attorney stood and began with the history of the land. He walked the court through decades of records, showing how the shoreline had been divided intentionally, how exclusions were not accidental but deliberate. He explained how the HOA had formed later, inheriting only what was explicitly transferred. As he spoke, he displayed maps and plats on a screen, each one clearer than the last. The judge leaned forward slightly, paying attention. Then came the moment Karen had been waiting for. She was called to testify. She took the stand with confidence, swearing to tell the truth, her voice steady at first. She described herself as a concerned homeowner, acting in the best interests of the community. She spoke about safety, fairness, and shared responsibility. She framed her actions as reluctant but necessary, the burden of leadership resting heavily on her shoulders. The judge asked her a simple question. When did she first review the original shoreline plats? Karen hesitated, then answered honestly. After the dispute began. The pause that followed felt heavier than any argument. The judge asked another question, then another, each one narrowing the gap between Karen's perception of authority and the reality of it. She admitted she had issued notices without board approval. She admitted she had contacted county offices without verifying facts. She admitted she believed enforcement power came with her committee role, even though the bylaws said otherwise. When confronted with her emails, her tone changed. She tried to explain them away as frustration, as informal language taken out of context. The judge asked her why she suggested removing my dock by any means necessary. Karen flushed and said she hadn't meant it literally. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked what she had meant. Exactly. Karen struggled to answer. The HOA's attorney attempted to redirect, but the damage was done. Karen had revealed what the documents already showed. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was pursuing control. When testimony ended, the judge took a short recess. Karen whispered urgently to her attorney, gesturing toward me, her composure cracking for the first time. I watched silently, knowing that whatever happened next would not be decided by volume or persistence. When the judge returned, he delivered his ruling slowly, deliberately. He found that the original plats were clear. He found that my shoreline was privately owned and excluded from HOA control. He found that the HOA had overstepped its authority by pursuing enforcement and litigation without sufficient basis. Each finding landed like a stone dropped into still water. Then he addressed the issue of the docks. He noted that while my dock sat entirely within my property boundaries, Karen's dock extended beyond what the HOA claimed as common area, encroaching into a navigable section of the lake subject to specific regulations. The courtroom shifted. Karen's attorney straightened abruptly. The judge explained that in seeking to assert control over the entire shoreline, the HOA had invited scrutiny of all structures, not just mine. By bringing the matter to court, they had opened the door to a full review. He ordered a survey of all docks adjacent to disputed areas, including Karen's, to determine compliance with county and state regulations. Karen shook her head slightly, disbelief written across her face. The judge concluded by issuing a permanent injunction. The HOA was prohibited from interfering with my lake access. All fines and notices were void. Legal fees would be assessed against the association due to its unreasonable actions. He encouraged the board to reconsider how much authority it allowed individual volunteers to exercise unchecked. The gavel fell, and just like that, Karen's campaign collapsed. Outside the courtroom, reporters from a local paper waited. The story had spread beyond the neighborhood, fueled by the spectacle of an HOA attempting to seize private shoreline. Karen pushed past them without comment, her earlier confidence replaced by tight silence. The HOA's attorney declined to speak. My attorney answered a few questions, emphasizing that property rights mattered and that escalation often created consequences. Back at home, the lake looked the same as it always had, calm and indifferent to human disputes. But something had changed beneath the surface. A week later, surveyors arrived, measuring shorelines and dock extensions. Karen's dock was flagged almost immediately. It extended several feet beyond allowable limits and lacked updated permits for recent modifications. The notice went out quietly at first, then publicly. Karen was ordered to bring her dock into compliance or remove the nonconforming section entirely. The irony was impossible to ignore. The woman who had tried to erase my access now faced the loss of her own. Neighbors watched from a distance as contractors arrived at Karen's dock. Sections were dismantled, boards removed, the structure shortened. Karen supervised angrily, arguing with workers, blaming everyone but herself. The pontoon boat was relocated, its usual place gone. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. Karen resigned from her committee position before she could be removed. New leadership was appointed, policies rewritten, enforcement procedures tightened. Apologies were issued quietly, without names attached. The association paid its legal fees and raised dues to cover the cost, a reminder that overreach rarely affects only its target. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the lake reflected golden shadow, I walked down my path to the water. My dock stood intact, repaired. Steady, I sat at the edge and listened to the gentle movement of the lake, thinking about how lines drawn in anger often end up erased by truth. Karen never spoke to me again. She avoided the shoreline, avoided meetings, avoided eye contact. Her dock, once a symbol of her authority, now ended well short of where it used to. The lake had not chosen sides, but the law had, and in the end, the water revealed exactly where the boundary belonged. The weeks after the ruling felt strangely quiet, as if the entire neighborhood were holding its breath. The lake returned to its usual rhythm. Boats drifting slowly, water lapping against wood, birds settling into routines uninterrupted by human drama. Yet beneath that calm surface, everything had shifted. People spoke more softly about the HOA now, more carefully, as if authority itself had become something fragile. Karen became a ghost of her former presence. She still lived in her house, still walked her dog in the mornings, but she no longer lingered near the water. The shoreline that once felt like her domain now seemed to repel her. When neighbors passed her, conversations were polite but brief. The confidence that once filled her voice had drained away, replaced by a tight reserve that suggested she knew exactly how far she had fallen. The HOA board moved quickly to distance itself from the past. New elections were announced, committee structures dissolved, and a revised enforcement policy was circulated that emphasized due process and documented authority. The language was cautious, almost apologetic. They invited homeowners to attend a listening session, a public acknowledgement that trust had been damaged and needed rebuilding. I attended that meeting, sitting quietly near the back. When the board chair addressed the room, he spoke about lessons learned and the importance of restraint. He never mentioned Karen by name, but everyone knew who he meant. The room was full, unusually so, with people who had never cared much about HOA business now paying close attention. Power, once exposed, was harder to ignore. Several neighbors approached me afterward. Some apologized for believing the rumors. Others thanked me for standing my ground, admitting they had faced smaller issues with Karen, but never felt able to push back. One elderly couple told me They had avoided the lake for years because Karen made them feel unwelcome. Hearing that confirmed what the court record already showed. This had never been just about me. Karen sold her pontoon boat at the end of the summer. The listing appeared quietly online, no explanation attached. When the buyer came to inspect it, Karen stayed inside, blinds drawn. The lake that once framed her social life had become a reminder of everything she lost. She still had her home, her comfort, her routines, but the authority she cherished was gone. The survey ordered by the judge triggered broader changes as well. Several docks required minor adjustments, permits updated, extensions removed. No one complained. The process was transparent, evenly applied, and overseen by the county rather than the HOA. What Karen had tried to control unilaterally was now governed by clear rules, enforced impartially. The irony was not lost on anyone. One afternoon, as I repaired a cleat on my dock, the new HOA president walked down the path toward me. He asked if we could talk. He apologized formally, not as a legal necessity, but as a personal gesture. He said the board wanted to rebuild trust and hoped I would consider serving as a liaison for waterfront issues. I declined politely. I had learned that proximity to authority carried its own risks. Instead, I suggested something simpler. Publish the records. Make every decision visible. Let sunlight do what power never could. He nodded, thoughtful, and thanked me again. When he left, the lake felt quieter, as if approval were no longer required for its enjoyment. Karen never appealed the ruling. Her attorney advised against it, and the HOA made clear it would not support further litigation. The case became a reference point in community discussions, a cautionary tale rather than a controversy. New homeowners heard it summarized in hushed tones, stripped of names but rich in warning. Control, once abused, rarely returns in the same form. Late one evening, I saw Karen standing at the edge of her shortened dock, staring at the water. The light was low, her outline still. For a moment, I wondered if she might say something, acknowledge what had happened, offer a gesture of closure. She didn't. She turned and walked back toward her house. Shoulders tight, steps quick. Some losses never find words. The lake, indifferent as ever, reflected the moon in broken fragments. It had been here long before any of us, and would remain long after. The dispute that once consumed the neighborhood now felt small against that scale. Yet its impact lingered, reshaping how people understood authority, ownership, and the cost of unchecked ambition. I began using the dock more often, not out of defiance but appreciation. Early morning became my favorite time, the water smooth, the world quiet. Occasionally, a neighbor would join me, sitting at the edge, feet dangling, talking about nothing important. Those moments felt like a reclamation of something that had been quietly taken and just as quietly returned. The HOA continued to evolve. Meetings became shorter, agendas clearer. Committees rotated membership, preventing anyone from accumulating too much influence. Enforcement actions required documentation and board approval. The culture shifted from suspicion to structure. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Karen remained a presence, but no longer a force. She attended meetings rarely, spoke even less, and avoided leadership roles entirely. The community had moved on, and she had no choice but to move with it or be left behind. Power, once lost publicly, rarely regains its former shape. 1 year after the ruling, the HOA mailed out a summary of resolved legal matters. My case was included as a single paragraph, factual and restrained. It noted the outcome, the costs, and the policy changes that followed. There was no drama, no commentary, just a record of what happened when authority exceeded its bounds. I kept that letter, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Rights, when unchallenged, can erode quietly. They survive not because they are granted, but because someone insists they matter. The lake taught that lesson well, reflecting whatever stood before it without judgment. Sometimes, new neighbors ask about the dock. They hear fragments, wonder why it matters. I tell them the short version, about lines on paper, about assumptions, about what happens when someone mistakes persistence for permission. They usually nod, understanding more than they say. Karen eventually rented out her house. The tenants were polite, kept to themselves, used the lake sparingly. Her dock remained shortened, compliant, unremarkable. The symbol of her authority had become just another piece of wood over water, serving its function without demanding attention. As seasons changed, the story faded into memory, yet its effects endured, embedded in policies, attitudes, and quiet awareness. The lake continued to belong to everyone and no one, governed by law rather than ego. And every time I stepped onto my dock, I felt not triumph, but clarity. In the end, Karen didn't lose because she challenged me. She lost because she believed control was hers to claim. The judge didn't give me power over her dock out of spite. He restored balance by enforcing boundaries that already existed. The law didn't take sides. It drew lines. And once those lines were clear, the water finally settled.